Whale watching boats are a particular problem, I believe, and it's a difficult problem in a way to deal with.
There is a role for sustainable boat-based whale watching, but it has to be sustainable for the whales first. And we jumped that shark a long time ago here, and it's time to get that back in balance.
Unfortunately, I think the influence of whale watching on the southern resident killer whales has been overstated to the detriment of the southern residents.
Killer whales come into the Puget Sound, and almost 10 to 12 hours a day they are surrounded by these boats. And the boats come close enough and the noise is loud enough that it reduces the whale's ability to forage, to hear their surroundings, and to communicate.
The Whale Watching Association had actually hired a lobbyist, and that lobbyist had been at work nearly since the day we recommended both the moratorium and the licensing system.
We're spending a lot of political time, a lot of social time, a lot of money focusing on whale watching vessels and other vessels, and not enough time and resources on salmon restoration.
3 days after I filed the initiative, we were sued by 4 whale watching companies who are represented by Pacific Whale Watching Association.
If the choice is them giving up 10% of their viewing opportunities or losing the southern residents forever, the choice is clear.
The latest regulations and guidelines that have come into play, especially from the task force and the latest legislation, these are some of the most restrictive regulations for whale watching on Earth.
We're willing to stay 6 feet away from a person to prevent them from getting ill. How about staying 650 yards away from an orca so they can eat?
Sound is really an important aspect of killer whales' lives. They use sound to forage. They echolocate to find their prey. Basically, they emit a series of chirps that go out and will bounce back off a potential prey item. They can find that prey based on the reverberation of the sound coming back from that item. They also use sound to communicate amongst each other. When they forage, they have to spread out, and in order to do that, to stay in touch with each other, they can't see each other, but they can use sound to communicate. The concern here primarily is something we call masking. And you all know what masking is, because when you go into a noisy restaurant, you know it's very hard to carry on a conversation. You can't hear the signal that you're trying to get because there's so much noise in the background. That same thing can happen when there's lots of noise in the marine environment. The animals simply can't pick out the signals that they're particularly interested in because there's other noise that's overriding that. So masking can override communication. It can also override foraging. And when it does so, it effectively reduces the range over which killer whales can find their prey. Whale watching boats come in and they find these whales wherever they are in the Salish Sea. And when they come close, the noise that they generate through their motors and through different systems on their vessels create enough noise that you get back into that masking problem. The whales can't hear the sounds, the essential sounds that they depend on in order to forage and communicate.
What we learned on the task force is what research has shown for the last 2 decades, which is that there are 3 threats impacting the orcas, all human-caused, and that they're interrelated. The first of those is there's not enough salmon. The second is that toxins accumulate in the orcas. And the third is that boat noise makes it harder for the whales to find their prey and to communicate with each other. Of those 3 threats, the only thing we can do anything about in the short term is reducing noise. To recover the whales, we need to increase salmon by 15% and decrease noise by 50%. What that says is that it doesn't matter how many salmon are on the sea if the orcas can't hear to find them. I proposed a recommendation to license the commercial whale watching industry, and as part of that licensing system, give the Department of Fish and Wildlife the authority to set limits on the number of boats, on the hours and times they could be with the whales, and most importantly, I think the areas they could be. The idea was that Fish and Wildlife could close areas to commercial whale watching the same way it can close areas to commercial fishing. Another recommendation that arose organically at one of our last meetings in November was the task force also recommended a moratorium on all whale watching of the southern residents for 2 to 3 years. And the goal of that was to span the gap between when the task force ended and when the regulations for the licensing system would be in place. We knew the licensing system would take a few years to put together. The earliest it could be in place was 2021. In the meantime, we have the whales coming back fewer and fewer each year. How do we protect the whales now? And we were all persuaded that the best thing we could do was stop all whale watching. So the governor happily agreed with us. He supported both the recommendations for the licensing system and the moratorium. The Whale Watching Association had actually hired a lobbyist, and that lobbyist had been at work nearly since the day we recommended both the moratorium and the licensing system. When the legislative session began, there was no support for the moratorium. So despite near unanimous support from the governor's task force and from the governor himself, the moratorium was off the table. That was the first time I've been involved in a process like this, and I was heartbroken. I had really relaxed into the confidence that with so many minds looking at this issue, we had come up with a clear and scientifically grounded recommendation that was shared by all the stakeholders on the task force except for the industry, and that our collective wisdom on this could be undone by a well-paid lobbyist. It was shocking to me to see how that works. Of course, if we'd known that that was happening, we would have been in Olympia from day one too.
One of the reasons why the Washington State Legislature did not pursue a moratorium is from a practical standpoint. When you're out on the water with any whales, and these are shared waterways, there's a lot of recreational boating, there's a lot of commercial shipping, and it's the faster speeds that create the most sound. Well, when we're out with whales, we serve in a sentinel role as markers for where the whales are. And recreational boaters are out, they're going from point A to point B. They're not even looking for whales. It's not why they're out there. And when they see us, they know whales are in the area and they can slow down and transit around the area. We'll alert ferries, military activity, commercial shipping, so that they can alter their behavior so that they can mitigate their sound impacts on whales as well. So having us out with the southern residents it serves as a really important sentinel role. It also provides a lot of public education, conservation as well. There are a lot of different sound sources in the Salish Sea and the inland waters of Washington State. Probably the largest contributors of underwater sound are the ferries from both U.S. and British Columbia. There are also international shipping lanes with a lot of big commercial ships coming into the ports of Seattle, Port of Vancouver, coal ships, container ships, car carriers. There's also a lot of military activity, military bases and military ships coming in and out of the area. Those are probably the largest contributors of sound. And when we're out with whales and we drop a hydrophone, you can hear that those large ships will mask the sound of all of the other boats in the area, recreational boats and whale watching boats. Whale watching boats, through voluntary measures as well as regulations, have really done a great job of mitigating their underwater sound over the last several decades. And it's progressively gotten more and more mitigation with newer rules coming into play in 2019. The whale watching boats for southern resident killer whales are now 300 yards from the whales, traveling at really slow speeds. And we know from a lot of recent science that it's vessel speed that's really the primary driver of underwater sound. And so when we're within a kilometer of any southern resident killer whale, we will slow the boats down to less than 7 knots, which dramatically reduces the underwater sound. And then when we're about 300 yards from them and viewing them, we're going maybe 3-4 knots. And so at that distance and that speed, we're the quietest boats out on the water. It's much louder for them if they're a mile away, there's a recreational boater traveling at 25 knots. That sound is the loudest sound that those whales are going to hear. One other factor that's really important to think about, and this kind of encapsulates the whole issue, is that we are seeing the southern residents in the inland waters of Washington State and British Columbia less and less each year. This is May right now. This is a good example. We used to see historically, May was a great month for seeing southern resident killer whales. They would come in here because they were following Chinook salmon that was going up to the Fraser River. The May salmon run on the Fraser River is dead. It's gone, and we no longer see the southern residents in May. We have not seen them one time in May this year. I think we saw them one day last May, 0 times the year before. We're starting to lose June, we're starting to lose July, and if you look at the salmon returns on the Fraser River, it is tightly correlated with the Fraser River returns, and as those continue to crash, we're seeing the southern residents less and less. And that Fraser River salmon is a food source that they heavily depend on from April through September, and that is absolutely the primary recovery action that needs to happen, is the restoration of Fraser River Chinook salmon.
When I first moved here, probably for about the first 15 years, I saw the southern residents quite regularly. And they were just out on the water doing their own thing. There were never any boats around. And then sometime around the mid-90s, I started seeing these inflatable boats right on top of them with people in orange vests. And we were all wondering, what's the deal? Who are those people? Somebody said they're whale watchers. That was a big surprise to us. We thought, what, really? Because that just wasn't a thing here then. And then they were joined by larger vessels. And over the years, those vessels were joined by big cruise ships until it got to the point where you never, ever saw the whales unless they were surrounded by a flotilla of boats. To this day, it's just gotten worse and worse. I mean, I have never seen the whales alone in the past 25 years, except for once when I was working down at the Lopez Ferry Landing, and it was about 6 a.m. and the dawn was breaking on a summer morning, and they went by, and it was such a precious experience. And I wish people could understand the magic of seeing whales from shore, of seeing them because they're there, not because you've gone paid $100 to have somebody take you out on a boat and chase them. It really doesn't matter what these whale watchers say that they're doing or what they're standing for. I mean, they have a public relations campaign that's very effective. You know, they've even whitewashed their industry. They call it eco tours. Well, there's nothing eco about going out on a noisy, smelly boat and chasing whales. There's nothing eco about going and parking next to a reef full of pinnipeds and shorebirds and blaring on your microphone information about them. Sometimes they're very far away, and I just see a cluster of boats, and I know the whales are out there. But I have many, many times seen them up close. For example, a couple of years ago, I was out at Shark Reef, one of our county parks. I was just standing out there watching the seals and sea lions that like to rest out on the reef offshore when I heard boats coming fast. And then I saw fins, and then I saw whales breaking the surface, and I knew they were southern residents because I can recognize them by their fins. These whale watching boats began literally herding the whales down San Juan Channel. Then they separated them. The whales became very visibly confused. They were jumping out of the water, going every which way. Then one whale broke off by itself and was chased by a boat right through this very narrow channel between Shark Reef and the little offshore reef where the pinnipeds are. I was looking down the cliff right on top of this whale and the boat, and I could see very clearly the name of it. I promptly went home and called the company and complained and said, I just saw this. They flat out denied it, said, no, that would never happen. I said, I was there. I saw it with my, where's the proof? Where are the pictures? The San Juan County Orca Protection Initiative was an attempt by Lopez Island citizen activists to enact what the Washington State Legislature failed to enact, which was an Orca task force recommendation of a moratorium on whale watching, which was later translated to a 650-yard distance setback for all vessels. San Juan County encompasses the southern resident orcas' ancestral waters and core critical feeding habitat. So providing them protections in these waters, we considered that to be crucial. And so what we did is we formed a political action committee. We hired a lawyer to write the initiative, and then I, as campaign manager, submitted the initiative to the San Juan County auditor. For our petitions, we needed approximately 1,600 signatures, and we ended up getting over 2,500 signatures in just 7 weeks' time. That's a quarter of San Juan County's voting population. It was an incredibly popular initiative. Why wouldn't you provide these critically endangered whales with the greatest protections you could, especially when this is what experts are recommending? This is what the Orca Task Force recommended. This is what the Canadian government recommended. You know, it's what many researchers recommend. The current distance protections are just not working. They're not working in these waters. They're not working anywhere. Since 2005, when the whales were listed as endangered, we have continued to lose approximately one whale per year. So a 200-yard distance setback, which is what the federal government requires, and now the very latest 300-yard setback, it's not doing anything. It's not working. And so, you know, the response of people to what we were doing and tried to do was overwhelmingly positive. One of the arguments whale watchers use, which has to do with their new phrase, were sentinels. Well, that's just about as false, bogus argument as you could possibly come up with. Studies show that whale watchers themselves commit dozens of distance violations every year, as do recreational boaters. So they're not acting as sentinels. They just want to be able to get as close as they can. Every now and then, there would be someone who would want to discuss it, who would bring up one of the arguments that they've heard through the PR campaign of Pacific Whale Watching Association. They'd say, but isn't whale watching introducing people to, you know, the plight of the orca, and then they can go on to become citizen activists? And, you know, our response to that was, there are hundreds of ways to find out information about the southern resident orca. There's only one way for them to eat. 3 days after I filed the initiative, we were sued by 4 whale watching companies who are represented by Pacific Whale Watching Association. They had 3 primary complaints. One was field or conflict preemption, and what that means is essentially federal laws preempt state laws and state laws preempt local laws. There are many, many exceptions to field preemption. For example, Washington State's 300-yard distance setback preempts the Federal Endangered Species Act 200-yard setback. So we felt that that wasn't going to be a problem. As well, there are no laws on Washington State books that allow boats to get as close as they want to the whales. There are only laws saying you have to stay this far away. So that was one of their arguments. The second complaint was it was beyond the jurisdiction of citizens to be able to enact an ordinance, that only the San Juan County Council has the right to do that. Well, we live in a home rule charter county, and what we discovered during this process is that's just basically a feel-good idea, that essentially it has no teeth. And so we lost on that count as well. And then the third complaint, and the one that the whale watching companies really focused the most on, was that their financial intake would be irreparably harmed by not being able to take out tours to view the southern resident orca. That is patently false. We know that because we subpoenaed the financial records of these 4 whale watching companies: San Juan Safaris, Island Adventures, Puget Sound Cruises, and Puget Express. All of their incomes between 2014 and 2018 actually skyrocketed. Every one of those companies makes well over $1 million and up to $5 million a year. During that same time period, the southern residents have been abandoning their ancestral waters, partially due to lack of fish and partially due to the fact that they just cannot hunt and forage here successfully anymore. So during the same time period, those whales spent very little time here. These companies saw their income skyrocket. Why? Well, by their own admission, they've been having these boom years with transient orcas. The transients move in when the southern residents move out. One of the most discouraging things about this lawsuit was the repeated references in both the papers and in the hearing referring to the southern residents as commodities. The metaphors that were used were that the whale watchers had just as much right to sell the southern residents to their customers as and I quote, "a butcher has a right to sell red meat, a farmer has a right to sell strawberries, a miner has a right to pan for gold." Now, the judge apparently thought those were good arguments. As a matter of fact, he said, I really could relate to that argument of a miner panning for gold. Well, if you're going to look at whales, these living creatures, some of the most intelligent, feeling creatures on Earth, as commodities, then it's pretty difficult to argue with somebody who views them in that realm. And so that's what we were up against. Really, the primary argument was all about money. And as with many things in our American culture, money trumped the day.
I came into this process with some rosy glasses on, and I came out wiser about how it works. No less committed, but a lot wiser. And I am confident that the only thing more powerful than a lobbyist is the truth and a lot of people who will tell it.
It's really time to move on to the focus on restoring the Fraser River and the Columbia River salmon returns. And that's really going to lead to what we need for southern resident killer whale recovery.
One of the questions that I'm often asked is, why is conservation of southern resident killer whales so important? We are here in the beautiful Pacific Northwest, where we have long had a reputation and claimed that that's legitimate, to have a reputation of being environmentally conscious. We want to maintain healthy ecosystems. The southern resident killer whale is one of the most iconic and charismatic species on Earth. And the fundamental question we're facing is, if we cannot save something as charismatic and iconic as the southern resident killer whale in a place like the Pacific Northwest, where we have this strong environmental ethic, then what hopes do we have for other populations around the world that we are losing at a rapid rate right now?
Loud and undone, you can barely hear the salmon run through the ships and the boats. There's only so long that you can float, silencing noise, fall and record from the deafening sound of the machines. When what we really need is a little bit of peace. How about a quiet time? How about a quiet place?
Loud like a drum, piercing through a never ever softened soundscape.
Noise never ceases.